Hi folks, you're with us today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this radio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the parallels between the feminist movement in communist Soviet Russia following the 1917 communist takeover and the feminism that we see today in the West. It's very, very similar, and in many ways it's indistinguishable. So let's have a look at that. Just to give you a sort of a backdrop, when the Bolshevik Party, that was their name, with Lenin and Trotsky at the helm, when they took over through violent revolution in Russia in 1917, they were wanting to implement, to a large extent at least, the international socialist state that Karl Marx had talked about, and that was outlined in the song, the workers, the labourers' international song. It was called the Internationale, and it's actually quite a catchy tune. And you can look at it online, and just put in Internationale, an E on the end of international. Really should get that, the workers' song or the labourers' song, something like that, and it'll come up and you'll be able to listen to it and listen to the words too. It talks, workers being exploited by evil bosses, and they're all going to be brought to book for their wickedness. And this was pretty much the socialist state, that the workers would no longer be exploited by, as they saw it, the owners of capital. So now the view that the socialists had always taken was that the socialism, or the socialist revolution, the workers' revolution, would take place in the most industrialized nations of the world. So, for example, Britain and Germany and France, that sort of thing. They hadn't imagined that it would be a revolution of farmer peasants. That they hadn't foreseen that, or didn't believe it would happen. The Bolsheviks were made up not of farmer peasants, but of Lenin was a lawyer, for example. Trotsky was a Jewish sort of intellectual. There were basic sort of peasant stock in the lower echelons of the parties, particularly after they took power and started to appoint regional goons and that sort of stuff. But they were really quite a middle class party. Bukharin and Trotsky, Lenin, and various others. So what they needed to do in Russia was nearly 80 to 85% agricultural. So nearly all the people lived on were dispersed over the the large number of farming communities. There were some factories and that sort of thing, but these the bigger cities, the Moscow and the Leningrad and so on, they only contained a relatively small population in the overall scheme of things, and far fewer people lived in the cities than did in say Western Europe. And Russia was backward a number of ways, in terms of miles of railway track, miles of sealed road. In almost every conceivable way, they were fairly backward. So what the communists believed was that they had to industrialize quickly and had to build up a formidable military machine, otherwise they would be militarily exposed to should any wars come along. Now, it should be remembered that the German army had crushed the Russian army in the First World War, even while they were the Germans were committed. Massive forces were committed in France against the French and the British. The Germans were so superior in organisation, tactics, training, equipment that they were able to inflict many defeats on the Russians. Now, the lessons that the Russians took away from this is that they were industrially unable to keep up with the other powers, and this was the main cause of their defeat. Which, by the way, was a reasonably accurate assessment. There were other factors, the quality of training of the German troops, and the quality of their equipment, but generally, as a general thing, that the Russians just couldn't keep up industrially, and this was a major factor. But coming now to the social engineering side, the Russians had to, as they saw it, change the way the way the entire society behaved, and they had to do this for a number of reasons. They needed to move people to cities to work in factories. They needed to change the way agriculture was handled and conducted, and they needed to move people into the cities so they had a large population base to work in the factories. Bear in mind, the early factories were very inefficient, so automation later on would change that dynamic a little bit. But really, it was just people at a at a bench putting the screw into the widget and then passing on to the next person. It was hardly an advanced industrial society at the outset, and they were able to make up for the lack of technology and automation simply by pouring a lot of people into it, which is what they did. Now, they looked at the number of people they would need as they perceived it, and bear in mind it's a communist society, so it's the centrally planned. Now, the central planners looked at the amount of labour they needed and the amount of factories they needed, and they realised they're going to come short by quite a long way. Just if they used male workers and young female workers, say, before they were married. So they decided that they had to have communal farms, and so instead of having individual plots of land and a lot of fairly small plots, really, they would combine these plots into a large farm. Now that was a large communally run farm. Now the idea of a large farm with a scale, a large farming on large scale, there's nothing wrong with that. That was reasonable enough. But they tended to appoint, well, not tended, they did appoint people who were ideologically committed to that communal farming rather than people that knew anything about farming. And they stripped the countryside of anybody that had any skills of any sort, really, because a farmer had to know how to fix the plough and how to turn the water wheels and to do various things. And so that was considered as an industrial skill. So the Communist Party just got all these people and brought them to the city. Now, this is where things like child support came in, by the way, when they moved all these men to the cities, often at gunpoint, by the way. But the women stayed behind to look after the farm and the like, so or to work on the communal farm. Now, when they moved people to the city, they still were well short of workers, so they had to move a lot of women to the city. And they pretty much decided that every able-bodied woman in the Soviet Union really had to work. If you weren't bearing children, you had to work, and this intensified during wartime, for example. Now, to do that, there's a few things they had to do. They had to completely change how society structured and how it worked and how the genders interacted with one another. So the state effectively became that they had to do two things. They had to break up the family and they had to break up the church. And they did the church with great brutality. But in breaking up the family, they did a number of things. But the first one was to say that, hey, guess what? All these evil men, they're oppressing you. Yep, you are oppressed. You didn't know it. Well, you were, and you've always been oppressed. So, sitting at home and looking after children and just working a few hours a day in the farm, that's oppression. What you want to do is go and work in that nice dirt floor factory, working 12-hour shifts, working 6 days a week. That's what you really want. And then you're free if you do that. but that means I'm working 60 hours a week and I've got a boss that's shouting and screaming at me. How can that be freedom from oppression? At least as my husband, I can kind of control him through various means and threaten to withhold certain things if he doesn't, if he doesn't behave. And that's no. He's oppressing you. If you're in the kitchen, there. He's chaining you. He is chaining you to that oven, and you are chained. Break your chains, and don't accept, your husband and you come and work in that nice dirt floor factory, and that's freedom. Okay, is it? Now they did this, and it was a constant campaign that you're being oppressed, the same way as they did to the workers. Hey, workers, you're being oppressed by the bosses. Now they're saying to the women, go and get a boss because your husband's oppressing you. I don't know how many people saw the irony in that, but anyway, off they tried to get the younger women with no children were the first. But once they started getting those women in the workforce, women decided that the only way to get out of working was to be pregnant. But you only had, I think, 6 months or 1 year off. So unless you had relatives to look after the children, and there were government creches, not very efficient, but government creches. Unless you had relatives look after the children, you couldn't really have children. Nobody really wanted to leave their children in a government creche. So, where they were subject to all sorts of ideological teaching, a bit like in the American schools, the leftist ideologies being imposed upon them, transgender this, and so that, drag queen that, and the likes. And not that they were doing that in Russia, they weren't, but communist ideology. So they're very determined to reshape society completely, and because of the socialist concept of equal outcomes and this equity thing, is that if everybody works and everybody consumes, then you've got the maximum amount of efficiency in terms of resource deployment because everyone's working, and you get the maximum amount of efficiency in consumption because everybody's consuming. So everybody is a worker consumer, and that creates a more equitable society according to socialist principles. It doesn't work out that way in reality, but according to socialist principle, it does, and it looks pretty good on paper. You'd probably go to any high school kid, senior high school kid, or college kid, particularly sociology, that sort of stuff, and they go, "Oh, hey, yeah, that's really good." Now it got so bad in the Soviet Union that there were more abortions being performed than there were births being performed in the hospitals. People had so little faith in the society and in the system and in the the future of the country under communism, and so they said, well, I don't want children. I don't want to bring children into this world. Now, given that the communist paradise, the communists were saying, but this is a paradise where everyone's equal and no one's exploited. Which wasn't quite that way in the reality, but nonetheless. So they reshaped society and the family and the church. And those are the two big things that any totalitarian or tyrannical sort of government will go for. You go for those things. Those are the things you have to knock out the way if you're going to have the sort of control you need to implement the social changes that you want to or you're trying to. And I'm not sure the Soviets ever achieved it, even in Stalin's reign of terror. You've got to sort of have the insanity of the communist sort of thing. Stalin is going to, international women's liberation conferences, and he's making speeches about, the equality of women, and women have to be promoted, and women have to be brought to the front, and making all these things that you hear today in the West that. Idiot politicians and activists and hacks and goons and all sorts of people say, but now Stalin was doing that and would go back to his office and would be signing death warrants. I mean, he could sign hundreds of death warrants in a day for people that he didn't know. it just anybody who's borrowed the wrong book from a library could be killed. So um, we just need to understand how that feminist, the Soviets supported feminism, not because they gave a shit about women. If you look at all the senior roles in the Soviet Communist Party, they're all men, um, and their contempt for women is quite obvious. Utter contempt for women is quite obvious. But feminism is a useful device to disempower men, to divide society, to make sure that society is not fighting the government. Instead, they're fighting each other. The genders are at war and this sort of thing. And the Soviets used this quite ruthlessly and exploited this quite ruthlessly, fanned the flames of it. And throughout and if you have a look, I mean, just Google, Soviet feminist propaganda, and you'll see an endless amount of Soviet posters that were all over the factories and everywhere you went, all the public buildings, exhorting women, don't you do what your husband tells you, and you go to work and you be loyal to your boss, and you be loyal to the party, you be loyal to the communist ideology, but and that's good, but if anyone else, the party is good and the ideology is good, but your husband is your oppressor, so don't you listen to him. And if he says black, you say white. If he says go left, you go the other way, and so on. So very much. Now, this is what we see today. And if you look at the modern feminist movement, now these people may have been like Betty Friedan and Shulamith Firestein, and all. They may have been. They're very Marxist in their views, and they may have been radicalised. Or Betty Friedan was a editor for a Marxist communist Soviet newspaper, for God's sake, in the United States. Shulamith Firestein was also Jewish, and she was radicalised at college, believing that a Marxist paradise was around the corner. If only we could crush the power of men. How stupid are these people? Seriously. And if you look at the same, nearly all the modern, certainly the United States, but elsewhere too, all the modern, 1950s and beyond, all the modern feminists were either Jewish and or lesbian, or had been radicalized by Soviet teachings. In the case of Betty Friedan, Soviet communist agitator training and so on. So they weren't coming from the point of view of equity at all. They were coming from the point of view of revolution, and completely changing the social dynamic in the West. And this is the issue, really. They're still using it today, the gender warfare today. There's violence against women. There's rape. Women are being raped everywhere. Strong government actions needed to stop these men, stop these evil men, because they're the Nazis. We're the good guys. And even though we take away their legal rights, we take away due legal process, we take away the rule of law, that's for a good cause. We're allowed to do it. If they do the same thing, they're Nazis. If we do it, we're good people. So really, we need to see feminism in the light that it is. It is a device there for the sole purpose of re-engineering society, and the globalists are using it just as the communists used it, because it serves their purpose of destabilizing society and eradicating all social trust between the genders and so on, and that makes it much easier for the globalists to take over. You've been a Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.